All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to you if you're new to the show today. All the rest of y'all, you know the deal. What's going on? How was your week? Yeah? That's good. Me? Oh, well, I had a pretty wonderful week, actually, on so many levels. First, my wife and 2 daughters left me alone. No, that's not what made it wonderful. I actually missed them quite a bit. But my wife took my 2 daughters to my in-laws and gave me a pass. She said I could stay home, mostly because I was working on a bunch of projects, like working on the back fence. I'm putting up a fence in our backyard and like doing a bunch of stuff. And I think she also just intuitively knew that I might really benefit from some solitude, which is very rare after you become a parent. Most parents out there know what I'm talking about. You lose all of this solitude time you once had because the kids just take up all the space that used to be there for that. So in any case, my wife took my 2 daughters away, and I have had the house all to myself all week long. And it's such an interesting thing because recently on this show and just in general in conversation with my fellow teachers and friends, a lot of the conversation is around community and wanting to get back together again and how much yoga is about community. And then this week, I was all by myself almost the whole week. And actually, I realized how much my yoga is about solitude, that ultimately it all started with me being alone by myself. And then something that happens in that space becomes the basis on which I want to then connect with the people around me and the world around me. But it definitely starts from a place of solitude and feeling okay in solitude. And, that is actually something that we will talk about today some in my conversation with Brian Cooper, which I will tell you about in just a bit. But first, there's another reason why this week was quite wonderful for me, and it's about community. It's not about solitude. You see, I had all this time in solitude, but then also this week was the week we had our community-wide yard sale. Some of you, if you've been listening for long enough, might remember I talked about how I wanted to meet my neighbors, so I went to my local neighborhood association meeting and ended up getting voted into the board as the communications director. Well, before the pandemic hit, I set up a website for them and did some stuff for the organization. And then over the last year and a half, things have largely devolved. A number of the board members had left, and me and one other board member are sort of like holding the pieces together of the neighborhood association. And usually every year, one of the big events for the neighborhood association is a community-wide yard sale where within a square mile, a bunch of us all have yard sales on the same day. And they didn't have the yard sale last year for obvious reasons, but this year, at least right now, all the restrictions are lifted. And so I asked the other board member, do you think we could do the yard sale? And he said, I don't think so. It usually takes like a committee of people, and there's like hours and hours of planning and admin. And I said, well, maybe I could just do it. All we really need to do is have a way for people to register, pay their $10 fee, put it all into a Google map, and then distribute the yard signs that says they're participating. Isn't that really what it all boils down to? I could do that myself. And so he said, go for it. And I, over the last 2 months, organized this community-wide yard sale. First, I sent out a doodle poll, and 42 of my neighbors responded, and 36 of us all agreed on the same day. So I said, okay, we're doing it on this day. And in the end, we ended up having 52 houses participate. And then a whole bunch of other houses who didn't even register ended up putting their stuff out too. And it was pretty incredible. It happened yesterday. I was out there. I got out there at like 7:30 and started setting up, and there was already like a crowd in my neighbor's yard. And I've just never seen so many people on my street before. I don't know what it was. Maybe people just have been pent up at home. Seemed to me there's a whole subculture of yard sailors who like have apps and they tell people, hey, there's all these yard sales going on. And there's like professional yard sale people, you could tell. And I just sat out there for hours talking to people and selling shit that was in my attic previously. And ultimately, it really was fantastic. It felt so good to be outside on my stoop talking to people. And something about that combination of having the solitude of my wife and daughters leaving, and then having this event of like talking to all these people in my neighborhood, that felt like a pretty good formula for countering all the other things that have been happening, that have been infecting my brain. And so in any case, I share all of that because that feels to me like what the yoga equation is, right? We spend some time in ourselves so that we can then be together with others. And that is absolutely what my conversation with Brian Cooper today pertains to. Brian Cooper started the Yoga Alliance Professionals UK, soon to be just Yoga Professionals UK. And we talk about that some, the name. And ultimately, I didn't know much about Brian. I had heard about the organization and how it was really some people in the UK who are looking to raise yoga teaching standards. And I have to say, I enjoyed getting to meet Brian very much. I intend to have him back on the show again. And not only do we talk about teacher training standards and how yoga gets imparted from one person to another, but we also talk about some stuff that's personal to me. I don't know if you were here last week. I was talking with Frank Jude Boccio about whether or not there's a mystical realm or not. Well, we ultimately talk a little bit about that at the end here, me and Brian too. And I just couldn't have enjoyed this conversation more. I've been thinking about it since I had it. I'm so glad that you will get to hear it today. Real quick before we do, I mentioned that in order to do the yard sale in my neighborhood, we needed a way for people to pay their $10 fee. Well, the reason I know how to do that is because if you're a yoga teacher like me who's been having to do your own yoga classes out of your own living room, essentially, you've needed a way to bill people to do that. And there's lots of different ways to do it. Sometimes, like, your website server has got a built-in thing, and there's all these people who want to sell you on ways of taking people's payments. For me, I have ended up going with Moonclerk, and Moonclerk is a way of doing recurring and one-time payments that I just think it's easier, it's cleaner, and it puts me more in the driver's seat, which is a much longer conversation, which we have every week in my yoga business class. But longer story short, you need a way to do billing where you get to be in charge and nobody can screw you later. And I think of all the different services that I've tried, Moonclerk is by far the best. I want to encourage you to check it out. And you can do me a favor by letting them know that I'm sending you by going to jbrownyoga.com/Moonclerk. That's jbrownyoga.com/MOONCLERK, jbrownyoga.com/Moonclerk. Let me also mention that this episode is brought to you in support by podcast premium subscribers. People like Mary Elise Adams Mercado and Lynn Boardman. Thank you so much, Mary Elise and Lynn, and to all of our other podcast premium subscribers. we really couldn't be doing this the way we are if it wasn't for the support of people like you. If you have been listening to the show and you want to have access to the full archives, or you just want to help be a supporter, becoming a podcast premium subscriber is the way to do that. It's a choose your rate. You can cancel at any time. And if you don't have any money right now, all you do is send us an email and we will give you a free account, no questions asked. But if you are in a position to contribute some, it makes a huge difference. It's what allows like an independent media like this to exist. So thank you to everybody who's doing that. You can find out about becoming a podcast premium subscriber, along with all of my other stuff, that yoga business class I was talking about, as well as my ongoing live stream classes and teachers call. All of my stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. I think it's good. You know, my wife and daughters are getting back in like a few hours. So I'm still in my solitude zone for a little bit longer, and I will touch base with you in that on the other side. So let's do it. Let's go ahead and listen to this conversation that I had with Brian Cooper. Hello, is anyone there?
Hello, Jay. It's Brian here.
Very, very good. Hello, sir. Good to meet you.
Yeah, and you too.
And I appreciate you giving me some of your time.
Yeah, well, you're welcome.
And, you know, it's interesting to me because just for anybody who's listening to this, and just so you know, I am already recording, that, you know, over the years, I've had many, many conversations about like people attempting to create trade organizations for yoga teachers. Mm-hmm. And I've been the vocal critic of the Yoga Alliance over the years. And for a while now, I've just kind of left that conversation, you know, like I just talking about the politics of yoga teacher training organizations were really just not feeling like a fruitful thing that I was doing. And more recently, I was having some conversations with people and they were talking about, well, there is still potential value for having such a thing. And, you know, what kind of, could we imagine other alternatives? And on that call were friends of mine from the UK, and they're like, oh, well, it's different for us over here than it is for those of you over there. We've got some options over here. And Yoga Alliance professionals, and then there's another one, independent, something that came up. And that happened sort of in coincidence with the email I got about you. And I thought, oh, there was like a little synchronicity there. And so I was just curious to get to talk to you today. But as I said, I don't want to get too into like areas of politics that I don't find useful. And I really am interested in like the substantive questions of what's best for yoga in terms of passing it on to generations after and developing teachers. So I'm saying all of that as a long-winded preface because I want to get to something more than just the history of you starting the organization, but I feel like we need to start there because people listening and myself don't really know the history so much. So maybe you'll fill us in some.
Sure. Yes, I'll try and keep it brief though, because I actually find it quite boring.
Yes, me too. That's the thing. I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time just you giving us bio stuff about the organization, but I feel like we need to do a little bit. So maybe you can just give us the basic bullet points of the organization, like when you started it and why you started it.
Right. I mean, the main reason that it was started was mainly because of standards, teaching standards, which seem to be, from my point of view as a teacher trainer, seem to be falling quite rapidly. And I did look around a little bit at the various options available for, as you call them, trade organizations. And the only one that was available in Britain really at the time was called the British School of Yoga, and they were sort of posing as they called it a governing body, which has got no legal status, and was really actually quite a deceptive message. And anyway, one of the big things that got people upset was that the fitness industry in Britain wanted to take over yoga. They wanted to start setting standards and regulations, and fitness industry doesn't really fit in all that well with yoga. So there's a lot of resistance, and this organisation, the British Wheel, were involved. They were with the fitness industry. They wanted to push ahead with it. So Yoga Alliance UK, as it was called, was set up basically as a counter organisation to what the British Wheel were doing. Then once it got set up, and I'm not getting into the long story why it's called Yoga Alliance UK. There's been a lot of controversy about it. There are good reasons for it, historical reasons. But then I started looking into the actual standards of Yoga Alliance in the States, and I was quite genuinely shocked when I found that you could have done a teacher training course, and 2 years later, you could set yourself up as a trainer and be accredited by Yoga Alliance. 2 years. I mean, I practiced yoga for 30 years before I became a teacher. And then I taught for over 10 years before I even dreamt of becoming a trainer. And here are people becoming trainers after 2 years. I mean, it's unthinkable. So the organization was really set up to put that standards much higher. And just very briefly, that meant you needed a minimum of 8 years before you were allowed to, apply as a trainer. And that's really how we started. Of course, we're a tiny organization compared to the United States, the Yoga Alliance, tiny. But in a way, that's good because it means that we are only accepting people with what we consider pretty good standards, and we're quite happy to do that and not just be, raking in thousands and thousands of training courses. I don't think that's a very ethical way to go about it.
I was just going to say, because I did see that, there's this one note on the on the website that mentions a conversation you had with the CEO of Yoga Alliance in 2006. And I do remember the Yoga Alliance in 2006. I opened a center and started a training program. That was after 10 years of teaching myself as well. I did that in 2007. And so I remember the organization at that time. I remember getting in an argument with the CEO in 2009, at an IAYT conference. So, especially in 2006, especially like when I started in 2007, I really do think the organization was even more of a sham than it might be now, because it really was just a rubber stamp. And I wasn't registered as a training program there or a teacher for a number of years, maybe 2 years after opening the center, because I just didn't believe in the organization. But at some point there was a pressure, like a market pressure. And I did go ahead and do it because I didn't want to put the people who were training with me at a disadvantage.
Sure. Yeah. I think this is what happens. I've talked to a lot of, well-known yoga teachers, and they've all signed up with Yoga Alliance, and on the basis, basically, what you've just said is that, that's a recognized stamp, and it's recognized all over the world, so I don't want to deny my students when they graduate that stamp. So everybody just agrees, and,
I know. Well,
it goes.
I guess the other thing about it for me is, and you just pointed it out when you drew one distinction. I know there's more distinctions between what the organization that you founded and Yoga Alliance has done. And that is simply just in terms of time frames, like the problem became when we created a 200-hour foundational yoga teacher training. And then there was some sort of assumption that was a foundation enough to teach. And to say, oh, it doesn't make sense for someone to be a registered yoga teacher training after only 2 years. They should have to be teaching for at least 8 years. Even just that as a protocol, I think would have an impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. It slows the whole process down in a sense. And it's nothing like myself. My time frame is probably unrealistic.
well, that's another point that I want to make, because I'm friends with Scott Johnson, who's sort of like my generation. I consider him seems like the torch holder of like the UK Ashtanga adopters. Like I think you were part of, maybe, there was John Scott and like that crew, and Hamish, or like these guys. I mean, there was girls too, who were sort of early adopters of Ashtanga in the UK. Am I right that you were sort of part of that group?
Yeah, I was. And I trained with Derek Ireland, who was really one of the key teachers. He taught a lot of people like John Scott and Hamish Henry and many others. That was that particular generation. I have to say that I was older when I started Ashtanga. I think I was in my 40s when I started Ashtanga. And then I went, it's interesting as an aside, you hear about age and stuff, but I've been doing yoga a long time, but I started when I don't remember exact my age, but I certainly was in my 40s.
Wow.
And I went to Mysore and stayed there for 5 months, and I did first and second series with Patabi Joyce. I can't honestly say my age was a barrier at all. It didn't seem to make much difference. So people like Hamish were certainly younger than me. They were like a younger generation. But we all trained under the sort of same, very similar, guidance.
I mean, wait, just to say, like, I have done some Ashtanga practice in my time, and I mean, first and second series is a pretty physically demanding practice. And I'm 40, I turned 49 like 3 days ago. And I don't know that, like, I think it served me in my 20s, but I'm surprised. I mean, I do think that there's a difference in age between somebody in their 40s and someone in their 20s and what their practice should look like. Do you disagree?
No, I don't disagree. I think it's just because I had already been doing yoga for such a long time. When I came to Ashtanga, to be honest, it wasn't that challenging. Bits of it were.
So what were you doing before Ashtanga? When did it start for you then? If it didn't start with Ashtanga?
I started yoga when I was about 20, not sure exactly, 21 maybe. Mm-hmm. And I basically learned from a book. And that's another thing which I'm not saying everybody should follow.
Well, what was your book? What was your book?
The first book, I can't actually remember. It was a paperback, and I picked it up at a party, and I went home, wherever I was living at the time, and I looked at it, and I'd already been doing a sort of yoga without knowing it. My favorite thing in the morning when I got up, when I was in my late teens, in those bad old days, was to sit in a big armchair with a cup of tea on one arm and a roll up, a tin of tobacco on the other, roll a cigarette and have tea and a cigarette, which was my way of starting the morning. But at the same time, I used to play around sitting in that chair, putting my leg behind my head. And I don't know why I did it. I just did it. So when I picked up this book and I saw, oh, look, there's somebody with their leg behind their head. That's what I do. The difference is I put it on an armchair and they were doing it on the floor. But basically, that's how I started. And then I did get various bigger books. I do remember Swami Vishnu Devananda's book.
Yes, the illustrated, with the big, all the black and white photos, the big page photos, right?
Yeah, and I just worked through it, and I literally would just open it somewhere, do the posture, copy it, then move on to the next. And by the time, maybe after about a year, I was doing a sort of very strange practice of cramming about 40 asanas into my practice very quickly, one after the other.
Just get it done. This one, then this one, then this one, then this one. Just like the pages, like you're flipping the pages, right?
And that's how, and I know I said, oh, I've only got 10 more minutes. I'll try and do another 3 in that time. Let's get another one. And oh, look, there's a new one. I'm going to try that one. And that's how I practiced for quite a long time. I never went to a yoga class. My first yoga class ever was actually when I did teacher training in Grass Valley in California.
When was that?
Ages ago. Honestly, I'm not very good with time.
I understand. But were you? So you started your first ever time going to an actual teacher's class was a teacher training. Is that what you just said?
Yeah. So I'd never been to a class because the idea of me going to a yoga class was just unthinkable. I just couldn't see myself doing it, and that's one of the things. I guess maybe my perspective on it was very much yoga is a very personal, private thing. I don't mean that in a sort of precious way, but it's just something I did for myself. I wasn't really interested in doing it with other people. I never quite understood why I'd want to go and practice yoga with other people.
I think that's to interject for just a second. I think it's an interesting point, one that I have observed as well, just in coming to understand yoga, that this modern group yoga class, it's a very new phenomena, actually. And that for like a long time, that's not the way yoga was imparted. And that very often you would see your teacher once in a while, and most of the time you were just practicing by yourself at home, as you described.
Yeah, and also, of course, if you were in India and you went to, let's call, for the sake of argument, a traditional teacher, people in the shala or wherever weren't all doing the same thing. So they would have their own personal sort of sequence of practice to do, and the teacher would come around and check and maybe give them a new posture. That was the way it was done, and it still is done in many places. So the idea of teaching a whole class as a group is, I don't know who introduced it. I'm sure it's been around quite a long time. But obviously, if you think of Iyengar and these enormous classes he would hold in various venues, then you get an idea of people all practicing in sync, and I guess similarly, obviously with Ashtanga, people practicing literally synchronized with each other, and that's one approach, but it's not the only approach.
Well, I think that's interesting they say that, because when those teachers came to the West, I've seen video of, I guess not as much Iyengar, but certainly Pattabhi Jois, like counting off the breaths and everybody going to him, like a lead primary or whatever. All right. So what was this training that you did? It was in California, you said?
Yeah, that was a Shivananda training. And Vishnu Devananda was still around at that time. Maybe that helps to get a date, because I can't remember. But I know he's still around.
I mean, I was a kid in the 80s in California. I grew up in Los Angeles in the suburbs. So I was there, but I wasn't doing what you were doing, So what was that like? What was that experience of going from the UK to California to train in Shivananda, having only practiced out of the book?
Well, no, I was working in the States. I was working in just south of LA, in Riverside, at the university there. So I basically left my job and headed up to Grass Valley. I don't really know how I decided on it.
So what was that decision about? Why would you give up a decent job to go to do some crazy yoga stuff? Because at that time, it was not in the pop culture. Like it was still underground when I got to it in like the early 90s. Yeah,
because basically I don't remember, I last counted, I've had at least 36 different jobs, and probably more. I was always starting a job, and then after 6 or 7 or whatever months, I would leave, and often I would go traveling and I'd come back and so on and so on. And I'd done so many jobs, and this job I had down at University of California, it wasn't going too well. And gotcha. When I left, I decided, the one thing that I do consistently in my life, or have been doing for many years, is yoga. And I just thought, why don't I actually try and make yoga not just what I do every day, but actually a way of living? And or earning a living. And that's where the idea came.
So then it makes sense. You're like, okay, well, what's the first thing you do is get trained properly or something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And I have to say that, there's many different views about Shivananda. I've also got views about it. But I have to say the training at the time, there were 10 people on the course. And I thought it was a wonderful course. I really have to give them credit.
There was no 200-hour structure to it, I'm sure.
No, it was a 1 month residential. I had no idea the hours involved. I think they were quite long days. I remember that.
Right.
No, there was no 200-hour or any 100-hour. It was just, there's the training. It's 4 weeks. And then, I stayed in Grass Valley actually and started teaching at the ashram. So I started practicing teaching.
Okay. So how long were you at the ashram after your training?
Well, not long. I can't remember. It was a few weeks, maybe a couple of months. I really don't remember.
All right. So then what do? Where do you go after that?
This is a long story. I won't go into it because I probably can't even completely remember.
Well, eventually you come back to the UK and start a trade organization for yoga teachers, or no, you come back and you get into Ashtanga. So how does that happen? How do you go from doing Shivananda? Do you try any other styles before you get to Ashtanga? Did you do your own Iyengar explorations too, like everybody else?
Sure. This is the thing. Again, it's sort of complicated, but I ended up in Germany for various reasons, and I started teaching in Germany. And I also met a very, very senior Iyengar teacher who was teaching in Frankfurt. And so I started going to Iyengar classes, and I learned a huge amount from that teacher, my teacher. And I was also, as I said, started teaching, and I was teaching mainly Ashtanga. I wasn't.
So wait, once you were in Germany and you were studying Iyengar, you weren't teaching Shivananda. Did you switch to Iyengar?
I didn't teach Shivananda, but I did at some point, which I can't remember when. I did live in the Shivananda ashram in London, and there I was teaching Shivananda as one must.
Yes, the eye rolls, and the shavasana, right?
Yeah,
see, that's the interesting thing. That's the switch, because I think a lot of people did that. That was the big three. There was Shivananda and Iyengar, and then Ashtanga became the kind of craze at one point. And I think a lot of people wanted to that we tried them all out.
Sure. Yeah.
And there's distinct signatures to them, I would say, at least when I took them. Like they had, like I said, like Shivananda had the eye rolls and the shavasanas, and Iyengar was definitely alignment oriented. It was all about the alignments. And Ashtanga was the series.
Yeah.
So what was the appeal to you to make Ashtanga more of a focus, or is that just how it happened?
I think it's just how it happened, but certainly after I'd been to Derek, Ireland, I was in India when he was teaching in India, in Goa. That became my practice, and then that's all I did. I practiced Ashtanga. I guess 6 days a week as usual, but for many, many years.
Well,
that's all.
In a way, it ties back to something you said earlier, because that's what I liked about Ashtanga, was that it was a set sequence that I learned and just did on my own. And even now, my practice, even though it's not Ashtanga, I have that. Like I have a sequence. I don't have to stick to it, but I like the repetition like that. And it helped me as a disciplinary tool for self-practice, which is where you started as, with you and your book. So it kind of makes sense.
Yeah. No, there's a great deal to be said for Ashtanga. I mean, it's got its pitfalls as well, depending on the type of personality you are. You can become a little bit obsessive about completing theories and so on. I mean,
I would be remiss if I didn't at least bring up the fact that Shivananda just had a recent expose, and we all know, and I've had many conversations on this show about Patabi Joyce and all of that. I don't think we need to rehash that so much, but whenever I'm speaking to someone of your generation who I do see is like the one before me, And I would say the people who I see like yourself, who've just like quietly held it down all these years, I have to ask, how do you think we reconcile that, what I think is significant shift? Like in the times that we're talking about right now, these figures, Pattabhi Jois, Mr. Iyengar, the Shivananda gurus, they were the masters, they were revered. And now it has been revealed that these supposed yoga masters were certainly, to say the least, not infallible and at worst abusive. As you said, it's probably not. It's been talked about so much. My own take on it is that if you put someone up on the pedestal, then you're going to expect trouble, and that was part of the problem. I'm not exonerating them at all, not in the least. But this is when I was in Mysore. I watched people who I thought were what I would have called grown-up men and women behaving like children. Giving this sort of holding Pattabhi Jois in awe, and I never understood it. And I was never part of this sort of clique. And similarly with Shivananda, there were gurus, and I've met quite a few of them, who for me were just regular guys. I didn't hold them in any esteem particularly. Iyengar for me is a little bit different, I have to say. I still have quite a lot of respect for Iyengar. But I think this is a problem. If you go to yoga and you're expecting maybe more than somebody can give, you tend to project things into them and see all sorts of wonderful things, and then at some point the bubble bursts. I think that's true. I think they also did fucked up shit, forgive my language. It has to be acknowledged too. I agree. And I think that I've always said that in all the conversations I've had on this topic about the falling of the gurus, it always seems to me that if someone's like sense of yoga or like the gift of yoga is sort of coming from some sort of external person or authority, and then that external person or authority is shown to not be what you thought they were, your sort of world is shattered. However, if it's not coming from that, if it's from within you and nobody else can touch it, then as painful as it is and as confusing as it is when a teacher of yours ends up not living up to what you would hope they would be, it's still didn't destroy yoga for me, it allowed me to actually have to go into myself and my practice deeper,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I guess that does bring us a little bit back more to where we started, because that experience that you described of having your practice over time and meeting these teachers and even seeing the things that you saw going on, that's like the early foreshadowing of Instagram and shit. Like people and other horrible things that have happened since, in terms of just the profiting and the fetishization of yoga. And that inherently involves the teacher training, because that did become like the business model. Like initially, a lot of people, I think, were very well intentioned, and they were in your generation, and they were like, we're going to bring yoga to the masses. People need yoga. This will help the world. I think many of us believe that still. However, the process of bringing it to the masses was successful, and it was done in kind of like a capitalistic way through marketing and branding and stuff.
Sure. Yeah. Obviously it's
well, my question to you is, you obviously watched it as I did, and we rode the wave of it too. Like, I imagine you have been teaching and making money off it all these years. So we've certainly benefited from like a yoga boom.
Oh yeah, of course. I'm not denying it. Absolutely. Yeah. I completely. But but I guess it depends on, I hate to use these words like integrity and all that stuff, but it is a little bit to do with that.
Why do you hate to use the word integrity? Why? Integrity, yes. Integrity, authenticity, right?
Yeah, it's just because it can be a bit overused.
Yeah.
And words are easy to pronounce, but, do they carry much meaning or, how real are they? So, I'm always a bit skeptical. But, I guess I have to use that word, integrity, and quality. Because quality to me is quite a big deal in yoga or anything. And sometimes I think maybe quality suffers quite a bit in yoga. And it's such a hard thing, quality. I mean, it's sort of elusive. What is it? And it's really hard to define it, but it does exist.
It's true. And I've said this many times, and it's why I've always felt that in certain ways, like trying to structure training by like hours was the problem, because you're kind of quantifying a totally qualitative thing. And some people learn very quickly and some people learn slower. And I think, as you said earlier, I think coming to like a deeper experience and understanding of yoga, it requires time. You have to live your life. It has to be in the context of your life, and it has to integrate over time. To just leave for 30 days and come back to the same life you were at, I don't see how that really, I mean, that might plant a lot of seeds, but those seeds need time to grow and they need to be watered daily.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is the thing I've discovered still, that, I have my practice, and when I do practice, I still discover that maybe I've been doing something not wrong, but not as well as I could have been doing it. And I think, God, that's just taken me 30 years to find this out. And, of course you can go to teachers and they can tell you things. And it is very useful to go to teachers, good teachers, and workshops and stuff. But it can be a very long process. And if you discover it on your own, for me, it's a much more powerful experience than being told it. So I think there's a huge amount of value in self-discovery. And perhaps one of the drawbacks in all these teacher trainings and yoga in general is that it's become quite prescriptive. Mm-hmm. So you're told things. You're told this is what you do, and this is why this works, and this is how you do this. It's all very prescriptive. And you end up with your mind filled with all these ideas of how it should be. And you don't give yourself very much chance just to make your own discoveries.
I know. Isn't that the thing, though? And it has to be individual. Like people, like you said, it needs to come from within someone. Like they do the work of it. And in a way, when I mentioned that I got into an argument with the CEO of Yoga Alliance in 2009, it was at an IAYT conference when they were coming up with standards for yoga therapy, which ultimately became the 800-hour standards that they now use. Yeah. And there was just, all kinds of debates going on in there. And we were trying to come up with consensus. And we didn't really come up with consensus because there was so much diversity. Like what you needed to learn to be a Kundalini yoga therapist wasn't the same thing that you needed to learn to be an Iyengar yoga therapist or a yoga therapist in the tradition of Desikachar. So it was very hard to come up with like a standardized curriculum that was going to be right for everybody. And it came to my mind at that time. I was like, well, then the trade organization can't be the police of the curriculum. Like they have to serve some other function beside that. Like they can give curriculum guidelines that are helpful maybe, but it can't be like we come up with a standardized curriculum for yoga teacher training that all these diverse approaches are going to follow and then we'll police it. Like that doesn't seem to be even possible.
No, I agree completely. That's exactly what we did at the Yoga Alliance Professionals. Is we got rid of although we still have a 200-hour thing there, we got rid of this table that shows you number of hours anatomy, number of hours physiology or whatever, philosophy, so on. To me, that is a complete farce. For one thing, most people just tick the boxes. It doesn't mean they're actually doing it. But also, every teacher training is and should be different. It shouldn't be the same. So what we encourage is that the trainers do what they do. But the important thing is it's made very clear to anybody looking to do a course what they are going to learn. And that is the important thing. You make your own, you form your own opinion about which course is best suited for you and for what you want. Mm. And that's the way forward.
I agree. And I think what I like about what you said is when you do away with that farce, which I completely agree, because you say 20 hours of yoga philosophy, that could mean basically anything. It's not even a standardization, but the key is to have there be a transparency. Like, I guess the problem is people want to be able to hold folks accountable, but I always feel like, I don't know, doesn't the teaching speak for itself? Like,
yeah, I think in an ideal world, this is what I always have said. I used to think, well, basically the good stuff will float to the top and you'll see it and it'll be recognized for what it is. It's good quality, it's good teaching. Unfortunately, I think in the real world, that doesn't always happen. Mm. And it's got to the point now where many people, without knowing it, may do a poor teacher training, but they don't know any better. It's not.
I think everybody's very well intentioned, but I do think that there's been, I don't want to say, I should just not hedge. It's like a dumbing down, like we used to call it the Instagramification, where you have young teachers who look amazing and can do amazing things and are really good at social media and have built yoga teacher careers on 1 million followers. And I think that's an entirely different track than what we've heard today. I mean, and I'm not saying, I've talked to some of those teachers and they're good teachers. I'm not even saying that they're not good teachers.
Yeah.
It's just the whole process of like even a yoga teacher profession being like a career in that sense of like influencer, as opposed to like just that person who you go to their living room and no one, you know what I mean? Like where like it isn't. So at some point, yoga teachers also became like media creators or something. Like I'm not excluding myself, doing this show and I guess that has a lot to do with the advent of social media. Have you just stayed off of it?
Yeah, I'm not very good at promoting myself anyway. I never have been. It's completely alien to me. I mean, I don't teach regularly anymore, but when I was teaching regularly and doing many workshops, I didn't have any database. I had no idea who'd been to my workshops. And I discovered with amazement that most teachers have big long lists of all the people who came to them, and they send them emails and newsletters.
You got to do that, Brian. If you want to have a sustainable professional life as a yoga teacher, you need email lists.
Well, I didn't do it, and I have had I'd say pretty reasonable time teaching yoga, and it's gone pretty well. And I'm just lucky because I guess I was, I do call myself a yogasaur or a yogasaurus, and I was probably just between these generations where, well, internet didn't exist, obviously, when I was doing a lot of teaching. So I'm somewhere between these old and new, and it worked. And I actually think that it could still work. I think there's probably quite a niche there for people who don't go onto social media, but build connections in other ways, networks in other ways.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I am that example, because I wouldn't say that you're in the middle. I would say you're the generation that didn't have the internet. I mean, it didn't come into your life until later, and that's why you never even really got on. I'm the bridge after you, because I had a whole half of my life without it, but then I've had like the other half with it, like kind of one foot on both sides. And I did it. I built a bit of a like internet platform in the early time of social media before the algorithms really got ugly. And then I got off like a couple years ago. So I've been off for a couple years now, and I essentially did what you just said. There's a bit of a return, and it has to do with scale. Like it's about developing a smaller sized community that can find a better stasis rather than spending all your energy forever like trying to reach out to the big wide world web or whatever. And making those more intimate connections. And it's sort of like a return to the church basements and living rooms in a sense.
Yeah, it is a bit.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of feels a bit more modest, a bit more humble, and just a little bit more laid back and everything. I don't think you get the same stress when you're not having to constantly fight social media to be heard. I mean, it sounds like hard work to me.
It is, and it's actually a total manipulation because it doesn't do what people think it's going to do. But what I also have been really liking to think of it, rather than like just like a return to old ways, because I don't think that's exactly right. I've been really wanting to imagine it, even if it's just like wishful thinking, as a bit of a renaissance. And I think there has been some of that, especially over the last 16 months, because the lockdowns put everybody at home. And I do think that there's been a real reassessment of priorities and values, and a lot of people trying to decide, you know, what they're going to do now that things are starting to open up again. And I've been talking, like, the last few people who've been on the show, or last few weeks, even before we're recording this, you know, one in particular, Julie Smyrn, she took a time off from teaching, and she's going back to teaching now. And she feels like she has to do a teacher training because it's the only way she can make any money. Because if you call it teacher training, you can charge $3,000. But if you use the same material over several months and call it like a workshop series, it's only a couple $100 or something. You know, like it's to me, I really want to see. I'm fortunate to have essentially been able to make my way without having to do teacher training for the last 2 years since I let go of my center. But I don't know that that's true for everybody. And I worry that, like, are we just going to go back to the same 200-hour teacher trainings that people were doing because that's what we know? Or is there a way for us to imagine other ways of doing training that involve more mentorship and longer periods of time? So I guess I'm curious to hear from your vantage point, having been through your history and then started this organization and been kind of interacting with teachers through that. What do you think are the elements that are essential or important or you value in the process of developing teachers or facilitating people who feel like that's a calling for them?
I think you just mentioned one of the things, and that's mentoring, and actually what you might even call apprenticeship. So that is sort of going back a little bit to let's call it traditional. It's probably not, but give it the word traditional. Where there's more interaction on a personal level between the trainer and the student, and I think the way forward will be a reevaluation of, again, it's a little bit like this, as we started off teaching, you know, talking about anger, teaching, you know, 400 people or something at once. There's maybe going to be a reevaluation with teacher training where no longer will you be in a class of 40 people, but you might take some classes like this, but you will also have a lot more mentoring and a lot more contact with the trainer. And this for me would be a much better way to go than the current setup.
I agree. I think the problem is that, again, there's sort of like these financial pressures, because if you are somebody who has been at it for long enough and you've got knowledge base enough to do these more extensive trainings and people are hungry for them, and you can get 50 people to sign up for teacher training and all pay $3,000. That's a big chunk of change all at once, you know? And I've been sort of advocating to a lot of teachers that actually, if you were to have less students, let's say not 50, but maybe 20 or something, or 25. And then what you do is you take that and you spread that month out over a year, and it becomes a monthly recurring payment of whatever it is, $280 a month or whatever. and then it stretches out, it actually in certain ways becomes more sustainable because you don't have these like big doses of money and then nothing. Like if you get 50 in this group, but you get 5 in this group, you're screwed, you know, that in a way, trying to find a way to do the money that is more in line with the relationship, like you're pointing to, that I think that's right, that the facilitating of yoga and training teachers is about relationship.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. And I guess, I mean, the other thing right now is even if, you know, lots of people who complete a teacher training, that's it, they're finished. But really, it's surprising actually how few trainers have put in place post-course follow-through, like workshops and mentoring. That it just makes such a lot of sense. So in a way, a teacher training course should become less boundaried and more fuzzy. Like you don't, as such, finish it, or you might finish it at some point in the distant future. But there's not this clear cut. Now I finished. It's much more, I've done this, I've done maybe call it a core part of the course, and now I'm going to spend the next X number of months or years following through on this and adding to it.
I love that. I think that's so right. Because that's what I was doing was people would train and then I was just at the center 6 days a week and was available. So they could just come in and we would talk and there was just more time. And I would always say to them, at some point, you'll feel really confident about your ability to teach a yoga class. And I'll feel really confident too. And then if you want, I'll print you up a certificate. You know what I mean? Like it's just like, let's not make it about the hours. Let's not make it about the certificate. Let's make it about the yoga that's happening between us.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it seems like sort of obvious and common sense, but it's remarkable that hasn't really happened, and maybe it will happen. That's one of the things I'm hoping. That's one of the directions I hope we go in.
Yeah, me too. I guess it is. The problem is that when the centers switched over to, well, that was when they switched. It was when the centers were falling victim to the gentrification and the overhead just gets so much. The trainings were the only way to survive. And that might be true in some places still. And when it becomes the business model and you're like trying to upsell teacher trainings, you're kind of doomed. And I do think it comes down to scale. And we talked about this a lot in my yoga business class that we do, which is like, if centers have to forever grow to be healthy, there's a shelf life of like 5 to 10 years. You know, and to find lower overhead situations where it's not about building out a spa for people, but actually coming together around the substantive exchange of yoga, which we haven't even got to because you do this magazine that you sent me. What's it called? Amrita magazine?
Oh, yes, Amrita. Yeah.
Which seems to me to be an effort on your part to put out some substantive things for people, some resource for people to get inspired and learn off of, right? Yeah,
I mean, the idea behind Amrita was just, it's neither obviously an academic publication, nor is it your sort of, magazine, like I have to say, Yoga Journal.
Yes, you can say it. It's definitely not Yoga Journal.
It's not full of pictures of, basically like soft porn pictures. Yes. People doing yoga. It's sort of somewhere between. So it does have reasonably academic articles from some of the scholars who are around right now. It's great that they are around, and then other articles from teachers. So down to earth articles about what they do and how they do it. And it certainly has filled a void, let's say, in the yoga world as far as publications are concerned. I have to mention, of course, one of the magazines which I have great respect for is Namarupa, Eddie Stern's thing, and that is a really nice example of how yoga can be, not overly academic but serious, and I would call it again quality. And again, that's what I try and trying to get this idea of quality in things.
Mm-hmm. I hear you. I guess they don't always, but again, to the other point, they don't always like sell the same way. Like deep inquiries into the nature of your being are much harder to sell than handstands.
Yeah, absolutely. It's impossible to make any money from such a magazine. It's done voluntarily. So I only have one. There's one other member of staff and myself who actually produce the magazine, and we don't get paid for it. We just do it as a voluntary thing because I like it and I believe in it. Mm-hmm. No, there's no money in it at all.
I appreciate that. I mean, people doing labors of love and providing resource in the context of that is, I don't know, it's in the spirit of the yoga world I've known. And I appreciate that you do that. I guess that does kind of lead me to kind of where we are. And I'm sure you, like many people, have had to do a lot of teaching online over the last 16 months.
No, I've not done any.
None? Good for you. See, you're old school. You're so old school, Brian.
Yeah, I couldn't do it.
Well, but wait a second. Let me ask you. You've probably had meetings with people.
Yeah, I've done Zoom
discussions, right?
Yeah, but that's all.
See, that's what I was going to go to. I was going to say that I actually do think you can have a discussion about yoga philosophy in a Zoom meeting.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that can still be really constructive, good learning, and sometimes better than making everybody sit around in a room and be uncomfortable on the floor or whatever.
Yeah. No, I'm really all for some parts of yoga being online because it works really well. Things like philosophy or history, and actually with Zoom, some parts of anatomy, physiology, these sort of subjects, they can be really, really well presented.
And here's what I would also say is that I jumped online doing Zoom meetings. Well, first they were one-way YouTube live streams, and then I switched to Zoom meetings back in 2017, long before the pandemic. Right. And so I've sort of been doing it for a long time, and I have a sangha. I mean, I have people who've been coming to my live stream classes for years. And that's real yoga that's happening between us. And I've never even been in the same room with them. And I wouldn't have thought that was possible because I was very resistant. So I do think that there's even practice that you can do via Zoom meeting. However, what we said earlier about just time hanging around and being with a mentor, I think that there's got to be in the same room time at some point. And there has been Yoga Alliance everybody's doing full online trainings, a lot of people. And I realize it makes it available to a lot of people who can't be where you are. And I realize there's still value to them. I'm not trying to say they're all bullshit, although maybe a lot of them are. I do think that I want to say out loud, and I'm betting you'll agree, that a yoga teacher training has to involve you being in the same room with your teacher.
Yeah, of course. It's like I did write an article once about the online thing, and one thing that I pointed out was I called the online thing two-dimensional, meaning that it's okay for some things, and we just mentioned things like, I'm not saying philosophy is two-dimensional, but it doesn't maybe need such a lot of interaction with the teacher, but there is another dimension. And if you're in a room with somebody, obviously you see them, and actually there's all sorts of things going on that you can never really pin down. They're subconscious. Even how somebody smells, you might not be conscious of it. But these things, smell, for example, cannot obviously come across in a Zoom session unless Zoom get some amazing advance and you can start smelling other people. But it's not going to happen. So there's a huge number of things missing in an online environment. And that's partly why I think you do need in person for some parts of a training.
I think so. I mean, again, I have utilized Zoom as a tool for a long time, and I embrace it on many levels, but it is just a facsimile. It's why I don't like to have the video on when I record these podcasts, because while I think the video on sometimes is helpful, it actually is a distraction. For me to not be looking at me or you as a video image and just listening to your voice, there's much more clarity. It's just a facsimile in that regard. But I guess I do think that, I mean, we can't completely throw it out. And I certainly think there's a lot that we can do with it. But like you say, there's something, it's not even just about smell. I think that happens between two people in the same room. And that yoga, on some fundamental level, is about that exchange, not just of words and poses, but of like all the unspoken and impossible to put words to exchange that happens between people.
Of course, absolutely.
And I guess, well, I do have a question for you. I don't know how you're going to take this. I mean, it's not a bad question. It's just, you seem like a very understated and pragmatic practitioner. And I very much appreciate that. And I've been having this ongoing conversation that has to do with what I guess you would say the more esoteric elements, or I had a conversation yesterday with someone, which will probably post before this one, where the person I was speaking to was saying that they don't believe in the idea of like spirit as something. I don't know, like, I'm wondering for you, do you believe in like a mystical realm, or I don't know. I'm curious about, yes, I'm curious if you believe that there's a mystical element to yoga in your experience of it. And if so, how would you define that or describe it?
The answer to this could be really very long.
Well, we got a little bit of time. This is because it's a personal curiosity of mine.
Yeah. Okay. It's something I've given, a lot of thought to over the years. Yes. Well, to answer the thing about mystical, yes. Definitely. For me, there is a mystical side to yoga, and that's something which I experienced when I started yoga. And I am a pragmatic person. I'm a scientist, and I'd like to see things. I do like facts quite a lot, even though facts are a bit of a myth in many ways. It's very hard to find a real fact, but at the same time, yes, I've experienced, I feel that there is something mystical in yoga, and I'm sure there's mystical things in lots of things. But yes, it's there. What form it takes and what it actually means is another matter, and I think that is almost a separate conversation, because the whole yoga world for me, and probably for the last 100 years, is basically a fairy story, what people are told. And that's something that slightly concerns me. And I am a little bit concerned that maybe some of that mystical side of yoga has been taken away from people and substituted with what I'd call pseudoscience, or almost pseudo-mysticism. And that's a pity, because I think there is something very valuable in yoga, and I don't think it's always been given a chance to be discovered.
I so appreciate that, because I think you framed it right there, that the reason why yoga moved away from whatever mystical elements had and toward fitness is partially because it sold better, but also because of like the ambiguities that one has to confront when one explores what is whatever you want to call the mystical elements of yoga practice, and to give clear, like, easier black and white definitions for things, and why people like a scientific lens to look at yoga through, because they can say, here's the double-blind placebo study that proves it. I've got evidence to show. And I guess that's where my thing comes from. And this goes back to where you said at the beginning that for you, yoga is very personal. And I really want to commend you for how you're protecting something. And I'm learning from that in this moment, that there is a mystical element and it is personal. But the reason why I want to talk about it, and I don't want to not mention it, is that to me, that is really what yoga is about. It's certainly more about these subtle mystical elements, which you could call elements of purpose or direction in life, even more than like strength and flexibility. And in the making of teacher trainings, it became about, oh, this pose will strengthen these muscle groups, and this pose is for stretching your vagus nerve or whatever. And there's no way, and the parts that we've taken out, like that subtle time where you're just sitting in the same room with your teacher, not talking, that's when the mystical parts seem to be entered in more or something, or invited.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think it is really another conversation. I'd be very happy to have a conversation about this topic, by the way.
Well, do you have to go right now? I mean,
no, but it's just because it sort of opens up so many things in my mind that I hardly know where to start.
Yeah.
Overall, there has undoubtedly been what you could call a secularization of yoga, and I think that started back in the days of Vivekananda and people like him, who basically wanted to put yoga in what they called, or what they considered a scientific basis, and I think that was a mistake. And I think that's where the problem started. Mm-hmm. So, I'm only fishing one single little thing out of what's basically a jungle. But if you look at some of the traditional practices, okay, maybe you might say they're not just yoga, they're more to do with, let's say, Hinduism. The idea of having a deity, for example, that sort of disappeared, and I'm not going to get into cultural appropriation, but certainly you see statues in yoga studios and stuff, and they're nothing, they're just symbols. I don't know what they're symbols of, actually, I'm not quite sure. Whereas, a statue, you have this idea of infusing life into a statue, prana pratishta, this idea that you can actually take, if you like, energy or the goddess from yourself, your heart, prana shakti, and transfer it into an inanimate object. Now, for a scientist, or for maybe many people, not just in the West, that sounds like an absurd idea. And this is a problem because we're looking at it through the wrong lens. You have to look at it from a different angle, a different viewpoint. And what it does do is blur boundaries. It makes things a bit fuzzy. And this is where the mystical element may arise. Mm-hmm. And that is missing. That is very much missing in yoga.
So interesting. I really appreciate that. I think sometimes it's almost framed in this way, like you either believe in science or you're open to the possibility of what you just said. And I don't think they're exclusionary of one another.
No, not at all. No, they're not. And one of my main interests is physiology. What's going on in yoga when you practice yoga, what's happening. I'm particularly interested in the brain chemistry and stuff like that. And it's probably a bit boring, but what you can do with the brain is quite fascinating, and you can do it in different ways. And there's no doubt that yoga has invested a huge amount of time and experiential investigation into how you can use your brain. And of course, as even Patanjali mentions, the use of drugs in achieving samadhi. You can use drugs, but you can do the same with by yourself. You don't need external source.
Breathing.
So, yes, mainly through breathing. I have written an article on carbon dioxide in the brain, its effects, which is very interesting. And of course, you get people back in the day of LSD, people are all tripping out of LSD until it was banned, just because some people made far too much of a fuss of it, and the authorities got to hear about it. So, that sounds like fun.
Hey, expanding consciousness is really scary to power structures.
Yeah. But the thing is that then, Stanislav Grof came along with his holotropic breathwork, and he basically was researching with LSD. And when it was banned, he looked for an alternative, and he discovered or started using breath techniques. And of course, that's already been around. I'm not going to say for 5,000 years. I think that's probably not true, but it's certainly been around for a long time using the breath. And so this is really powerful stuff.
It really is. And you said just before that there's been a fairy tale in terms of like the story of yoga that a lot of us, and I'm including myself, were told. And can we is that fairy tale that yoga is this sort of unbroken tradition from the time of the Vedas, and that these are the masters that passed this down? Or what do you think the fairy tale is?
The fairy tale, just without going into much detail, but one of the fairy tales certainly is, and I don't do it so much now, but I used to go into like bookstores and look at the yoga section. And every yoga book I picked up, I'd open it, and after the introduction, well, maybe the introduction itself, was the story. And it said, basically, yoga is 5,000 years old. That's a myth. There's absolutely no evidence yoga is 5,000 years old, but that's part of it. And then it goes on to say, and the guy who created yoga was called Patanjali. Well, that's complete nonsense. And it goes on from there. And then, of course, it talks about these Patanjali's, the sutras, and then it talks about the usual stuff, the 8 limbs. And it talks about, it's so boring for me that
yamas and niyamas. You got to do the yamas and niyamas if you're going to be a yogi.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a problem. Where did that come from? Yeah. And then we have asana. And of course, we all know surely by now that Patanjali certainly wasn't talking about the asana the way we talk about it. He was talking about sit. But now everybody equates it with asana practice, and they go, I'm doing the 8 limbs of yoga. I'm doing nama, I'm doing the niyama stuff, and now I'm doing some asana, so I'm ready for the pranayama, and soon I'll be up at samadhi. Great. Really? Come on. It's not as simple as that. I mean, this is a myth. This certainly is a myth. And again, I don't want to get... In many ways, this has held yoga back. Because yoga is far more exciting than this. There's far, far more available than this story.
I couldn't agree more with what you just said. I was on that hamster wheel of like, I'm doing my asana, my pranayama, and my meditation because I'm trying to get to samadhi so that I will no longer feel all this pain in me or whatever. And that definitely didn't work. It was having to unlearn that, essentially.
Yeah, sure.
I had to spend a lot of time unlearning that. And I think you're right. I think that idea about yoga is some sort of linear progression to some grand something other somewhere else or whatever, that has absolutely been not helpful to a lot of people, or actually perpetuated a lot of the same dysfunction that other, world religions and vehicles of control have propagated on people,
Yeah, it's like what I said earlier on. It's a bit like if you read this stuff, then you think, oh, that's how it is. And you stop thinking for yourself, and you maybe stop discovering things because you've been told what it is. It's really a shame. It really is doing a huge disservice to what I see as a really very exciting subject.
Well, I would say like the counter in my mind to that, the good news, if I can find it, which I believe I can, is that a lot of times people come to this. Like I can't tell you how many people, like I've staked out put a little flag in the ground somewhere on the wide world web, and people will show up and I've been practicing for years and years, and they come to a lot of this stuff, Like I do think people practicing over time, there is some kind of maturation where people know, like, it's not just about being able to put your leg behind your head.
Sure. And yeah, that also brings, that moves into different areas, and that is there such a thing as evolution in yoga? Do people really advance through karma and reincarnation? What do people really believe who do yoga, or maybe not believe? These are really interesting subjects.
I know. The reason I brought this up with you, Brian, is because yesterday, and people will all hear this before they hear this one, I spent 2 hours doing what you just said with someone, like really getting into what do you really believe about this stuff. And it was really intense. And you know what? I'm looking at the clock, and we have done over an hour already. So you may have to come back, Brian, because if you will, because I really do think what you just said about people talking about, especially people who've been practicing for as long as you have, and people who are scientists, because I think there are plenty of scientists out there who allow for both things to exist at the same time. And it is important for those conversations to be had. So, because in a way, that's the counter to like the superficialization.
Yeah.
So are you going to do it? Are you going to come back again if I invite you in a couple of months?
Yes.
I'm pressuring you on air, okay?
Yeah, no, I'm committing myself on air.
All right, good. I'm doing that because I have enjoyed this very much, Brian. Thank you. I do think it really gives me and anybody who listens to this like a better idea of where Yoga Alliance Professionals UK is coming from. Are you changing that name? I saw somewhere like you want to drop Alliance. Is the name going to be changing? Or are you keeping it? Where's that at?
Yeah, we do. It was really quite unfortunate using the word alliance. It's caused us quite a lot of problems. Yes, the problem is, of course, it's quite hard to change a name that you've been using for quite a long time. It's quite a major shift.
Well, look.
But yes, the intention is to change.
I think you should do it. And, this show gets pretty good reach. Maybe you use this as an impetus. Like, just switch it. Switch it to Yoga Professionals UK, formerly known as, for like a year. And then you'll drop the formerly known as.
Sure. Yeah. That's ideal.
Very cool, Brian. Thank you so much for this. I will be in touch with you. There'll be links for everybody to find the organization and your stuff, the magazine. So thanks for coming today and talking with me. I really appreciate it. And I will reach out to you again.
Yeah, it's been really nice talking to you, Jay. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Take care, all right?
Okay. Bye for now.
Bye. And there you go. How about that, y'all? There sure is a lot to chew on in that, isn't there? Wow, I really had a lot to think about. First of all, I so appreciated the picture that Brian paints of practice as a truly personal thing. It's just for you in yourself. Like I was saying in the intro, it's about solitude in many ways. It's not necessarily about going and having the big group of people that you're with. I know that seems contrary because I want people to come to my group yoga classes too, but on some fundamental level, the process of yoga practice and understanding, it has this inherent element of solitude. It's just for you. So I really got a sense of that from Brian. And then just this idea of stretching out the process by which someone would call themselves a teacher or train teachers. Like just make it take longer and make it involve more direct interaction between a mentor and a mentee. Right? Of course, you got to figure out how we're going to make the money work for all that. But as a just general thing, I think there's becoming a consensus forming from all the people I've been talking to and asking about this. And lastly, I only broached it at the very end with him, but him acknowledging the mystical realm and still being like a science guy is hugely important for me. Last week, it seemed like those things might be at odds, and I don't think they have to be. And I get that it's something we don't necessarily want to talk about in certain venues. Like, I think back to when I had Kate Herrera Jenkins on not too long ago, and she was talking about the Native American Indian tribe that she's from, and I was asking her about the mystical realm in that tradition, and she was protective. She said, we don't really talk about these things so much, only in certain situations when it's right. And I get that. I get that we might want to be protective of some of these things. However, as I discussed with Brian today, it's one thing to just protect it. It's another for it to just disappear. And there's nowhere you ever get to learn about these things or have time and space to explore them. So, in any case, thank you so much to Brian, and I'll definitely have him back on again so we can find out more about what he actually believes. This was really stimulating, and I'm grateful for it. So thanks again, Brian. And next week, it continues. You see, these podcasts, the one with Frank and this one, and then next week, they were all recorded in a succession, like sort of right after each other. And so the thread runs through them all. And let me just say, next week's is also quite deep, and I encourage you to tune into it. All right, let's see. Other than that, I wanted to say something about the tour. I'm trying to organize some in-person weekend workshops like I was doing before the pandemic shut the world down. And it looks like I might be going to Florida in October. I had been thinking about going to Austin, Texas in September. It's still a little bit up in the air. And I gotta say, I'm having a little bit of doubts about my plan. Not that I'm going to do the tour, but where I'm going to go. You see, before the pandemic, I came up with a plan of where to go based on like where people were. Like I had a sense of where the people were who were interested in practicing with me or having me come to their town. We had even done like some polling and stuff, and we came up with a list of places for me to go to. And my plan was just to pick it back up and hit those places again. But I'm starting to wonder whether that's the best plan. So I might do that, but I'm also wondering if you're out there and you're listening to this right now and you would want me to come to your city or your town, even if it's like not a big city, even if it's like a small town somewhere. Do me a favor, just shoot me an email, say, hey Jay, I'm listening. I would love for you to come to my town. It would really be helpful to me to try to get some sense of who out there listening to this would be interested in that. So do me that favor, shoot me an email if you would come, if I were to come to your town, because I'm trying to figure out where I should go. And other than that, I think that's it, Joe. I think we're pretty good. As I mentioned, I've got a few more hours before my wife and daughters get back. What am I going to do with it? I'm probably going to go out backyard and work on the fence more. I mentioned I'm working on putting in this fence. We had like a couple of contractors come. Our backyard fence was just like falling apart. So we got some estimates, and they were just so exorbitant. They were beyond what we could afford. One of them was really cool, and he educated me, though, on what needed to happen. So we came up with a DIY solution. I got the materials through Home Depot. But we're making it happen. It's going to totally look good. It's going to be good. It's going to be structural. We're doing it better probably than some other people would. But, I'm not really someone who has a lot of experience building fences or doing that kind of work because I grew up in the suburbs and then moved to the big city. And I've just been doing it all on my own, YouTube videos and stuff. And it's going well. And I have to say, it's really feels good to just be out there shoveling and busting my ass, but occupying myself with like a manual labor. Feels good. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go work on the fence. And I hope you're doing all right. Is everything okay? People starting to get back into their lives again? Or are you still on lockdown? I mean, I don't even know. I used to be trying to keep tabs on what was going on and where, and I stopped trying to keep tabs on it anymore, y'all. What's the point? We just got to roll with it. We got to roll with it. So that's what I'm doing. Hopefully, you're keeping your wits about you too. In the meantime, what do you say we be kind? What do you say we be kind to ourselves and to others? I think that's a very good idea. Hopefully you agree. Please take care, y'all. I will talk to you again soon. Cheers.